Black Officer, White Navy is a memoir written by a Black Navy officer who rose from high school dropout to one of the unrestricted line officers in the Navy during the post-Vietnam era. Today, I talk one-on-one with the author of the book, Reuben Keith Green, for this edition of Quintin's Close-Ups. And if you haven't already, subscribe to my YouTube channel and like Quintin's Close-Ups on Facebook. Reuben Keith Green, welcome to Quintin's Close-Ups, Keith.
Hey, thank you. Happy to be here.
Oh, you're very welcome. I know that obviously me and you are actually friends on LinkedIn, and you reached out to me a couple of months ago, basically wanting to do an interview about obviously a book that you just wrote. But I know that you have retired from the United States Navy back in 1997, completed your Master's of Science degree from Webster University in 2000, and wrote and published a book on your military service and observations in 2017. And I know that you have read and studied on minority military service for decades, along with playing at restoring an old house and digging in the dirt, as you say. And now, obviously, you're out with your new book about minority veterans and their stories, and obviously their contributions to this country. Let me ask you this: who is Keith Green these days?
Well, Keith Green is a retired, naval officer that was silent for like 20 years after I left the service. And I decided I ought to start trying to tell the stories of minority veterans because they really don't exist in the literature. In the Vietnam War, there's only a handful of stories or books written about African Americans. Two of those were written by people that never even served, and those were novels. So there's there's more coming out now, but there's just very few stories of service, memoirs by individuals that aren't famous that have told their story. So I've started trying to get people to tell their stories. I have a questionnaire on my LinkedIn page that people can use, either family members or individuals. And I think it's important that we start filling in the gap in the literature because people don't understand the challenges that minorities face when serving this country. It's slowly beginning to become more apparent, though.
Yeah. And how many more gaps do you want to fill with this particular issue?
Well, what I want to do is make people aware that there are, in fact, these challenges. And I have pointed out multiple examples of things that can happen to someone who's is not a typical white male, whether it be female, gay, Hispanic, whatever, or even a religious minority. So there are certain patterns of behavior that can happen. I had a great career up until the last job that I had, and I went to work for a guy from Alabama that took one look at me and decided who I was just based on the color of my skin. And it went downhill from there. I'd had a 20-year stellar career with some bumps in the road, but people don't change their upbringings very much. I spent my first 2 years in Charleston, South Carolina in 1975, and I'm here to tell you that was an eye-opening experience.
Wow, and this is where I'm sitting right now in my hometown. But let me ask you this, Keith, and this is just a simplistic question, but what are the challenges right now for the average minority in the military?
Well, the culture wars that you see happening out in society about Black Lives Matter and about police brutality and about, not so much affirmative action now, they call it equity these days. Those same challenges exist in the military. People bring their attitudes into the military with them when they come. And it's hard for them to shake their upbringing because if they disavow what they've been taught their whole lives, that means they have to disavow their parents or grandparents or uncles or cousins. And so it's hard. You can't just write a directive and say, this is the way things are going to be because people bring their beliefs and their perspectives with them. So some of the same things that you see, black men being intimidated. There was an Air Force pilot on 60 Minutes a few months ago that was told that you're big, you're black, and you've got a deep voice. And if you don't fix those things, you're not going to make it in this organization. Well, those are three things that are very difficult to fix. So that's the kind of perception that he was facing, and he decided he was going to get out of the military. Well, I'm big, I'm black, I have a deep voice, and that was 20 years ago. So that's just one particular challenge, and but there are many others.
What is the biggest difference from 20 years ago to right now?
Well, the biggest difference that I see is that there are much more minority officers and senior leaders in positions of authority, many more than there were when I was in the Navy. I got out of the Navy in 1997, and the officer percentage was like 3.5%. When I joined in 75, it was 0.5% minorities. So I served on 3 ships in a row, and I was the only black officer on every ship I served on. So there was no support group. When they put women on submarines, they sent them 4 or 5 at a time per submarine. They didn't do that with minority officers. You would typically be the only one there. It's not like that now, from what I can gather. I just spoke to a group of intelligence officers in Suffolk, Virginia, last month, and I was shocked at the number of senior black officers that were in that room, and including the most senior black Navy female captain in the United States Navy. And she spoke out because my talk was on mentorship and sponsorship, and she said that she had 31 years in the Navy and no one had ever talked to her about sponsorship. So there are things that have changed and there are things that haven't. If you don't know how the rules work, if you don't know how the game is played, then you're at a disadvantage.
Well, how is the game played?
Well, how's the game played? You need, if you're going to be successful in the military, you need to have someone there that is watching out for your career, that is advising you, and that is sponsoring you, whether you're up for an important job or perhaps you may have gotten yourself into a little trouble or there's an issue with your performance, and you need someone to advocate for you on your behalf, or even if you're going up for promotion. Right. I dreaded going up for promotion because I was being judged by a room full of people that didn't know me. And the first thing they did was look at my picture and saw a black officer. And sometimes they have preconceived notions about minority officers. I had a Navy captain tell me on LinkedIn that black officers got special consideration at promotion boards. And that was, nothing could be further from the truth, but that's what he believed. And he was a retired Navy captain, and he walked into the room with that perception. So that can have an impact on someone's career. The results you see now, the Navy's gone backwards in the number of black flag officers, because 20 years ago, people were making decisions that were detrimental to minority officers. No one was holding them accountable for that.
Who's holding them accountable now?
Well, each of the service chiefs have put out lots of directives. They've done all sorts of reports and initiatives. But as far as individual accountability, that's one of my pet peeves, is that individual accountability is very difficult to get in the military. There is no Uniform Code of Military Justice article for racism or discrimination. It all falls under some other catch-all article, provoking words and gestures, conduct unbecoming, stuff like that. But people don't know where the line is. There are people that engage in racist behavior. They have no idea that the behavior that they're engaging in is racist. There's a Marine 2-star general who got relieved just a few months back. He's out of the military now, but he was using racist language and racist stereotypes in addressing some of his Marines, and he didn't realize that his behavior was racist. And he wound up leaving the service under a cloud, but he still doesn't believe that what he said was racist. So there needs to be further education, and they need to define exactly what racist behavior is, because DOD can't do it. The other thing they need to do is they need to publish the discrimination complaint statistics. No service member has any idea what will happen if they file a discrimination complaint, and typically that information was available in the annual defense reports to Congress. I had all of those reports when I wrote my book, and I used some of them in my book to describe what would happen if you filed a complaint. For instance, in 1989, when I was serving on I was the chief engineer on a frigate out of Mayport, Florida. I was the only black officer on the ship. I was having a racial incident about once every 3 weeks, I calculated it. But in 1988, the chief of naval operations said there was widespread bias and discrimination against blacks in the military. And in 1989, they substantiated 0 of 156 complaints. So you've got all this widespread bias and discrimination, but you can't find a single instance of it in a formal complaint. Something was wrong with that system. Now, DOD, after my book came out, they scrubbed all of that historical information from the record. You can't find it anywhere. So now, rather than deal with it directly and forthrightly, they just tried to hide the statistics.
What other statistics are they hiding, Mr. Keith?
Well, every service was required, starting in 1987, to report formal discrimination complaints that were submitted. They had to indicate the number submitted, the number that was substantiated, and the number not substantiated. And the Navy does not have the best history of that. For instance, in 1987, they substantiated 6% of the complaints. They had about 50. In 1988, they substantiated 3% of the complaints, and they had about 100. And in 1989, they had 156, and they substantiated 0. So the more the complaints went up, the lower the substantiation rate went. That exact same pattern repeated itself starting in the first year of the Trump presidency, with all the rhetoric and the hostility that was there. The number of complaints jumped significantly, but the substantiation rate dropped from 20% to 60%. I know that because it was reported in a Reuters news article about how difficult it was for minorities to have a successful complaint of discrimination. So I've been pushing that issue both with Congress and with the military. I've written several articles that are available online. One for the Center of International Maritime Security, and I'm working with a shipmate of mine that I met on LinkedIn. I've been admiring him from a distance, and he has become involved. He's a white guy, retired Navy captain, 30 years, award-winning leadership person, and he's taken an interest and become involved in helping me push some of these issues.
Where is the leadership on these issues?
Well, that's something that they say all the right things, but then they don't address issues that are brought up either in the public or in Congress. I watched some congressional hearings a while back about extremism in the military, and there was a gentleman there named Bishop Garrison who went on to work for Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. And the leadership is saying all the right things, but they're getting a lot of pushback from certain segments of Congress about the anti-extremism training, calling it woke training, et cetera, et cetera. And they really have no idea what they're talking about, but it riles people up the same way affirmative action did in its day. And it's designed to undermine the military, and I think that's unfortunate.
What else is undermining the military in your mind?
Well, when the leadership is saying that we have a problem with extremism, we have a problem with discrimination, and you have Congress pushing back saying, no, there is no problem. The problem is the training, et cetera. It reminds me of when Admiral Zumwalt in 1973 was called to task about the race riots that were happening on the Kitty Hawk and the Constellation Hasayampa. Chairman of the Armed Services Committee, John Stennis, ordered subcommittee hearings on permissiveness. He said, well, the problem is you're being too permissive. You're coddling these people. Stennis has a very colorful history as a segregationist and a racist. He was the architect of the Southern Manifesto, which was written in his office. I'm reading his biography right now. So if you're getting pushback from Congress and you're getting pushback from military people in uniform, that makes it very difficult for the military to further cohesive service. And Ronald Reagan named a aircraft carrier after John Stennis. With his long racist history, is still named an aircraft carrier after him. And I've been pushing. I wrote an article a couple of years ago called "The Case for Renaming the John C. Stennis," and that made it all around the world. They were even talking about it in Russia. So I'm waiting for the military. The decision on renaming that ship was supposed to come out this month. I'm just waiting to see what's going to happen with that.
What are your obstacles and opportunities in the military?
Well, the opportunities were just the same as anybody else had. If you go in the military and you're a good performer and you do things the right way, you can go as high as I did, or even higher. There are guys that came in just like me. You can't come in the way I came in. I was a high school dropout in '75 when I came in. You can't do that anymore. You have to have at least a high school diploma. But I was able to get my bachelor's degree while I was on active duty. I was promoted early to E6, made E6 in 6.5 years, which was very difficult to do. I was the most knowledgeable person, almost the most knowledgeable person that took the test when I got promoted to E6. And so the opportunities are there. Once I became an officer, I was on a hot path to the top, so to speak. And I had obstacles in that I was dealing with people. Some of it was jealousy, and some of it was racism, and some of it was just apathy, because people that saw what was happening to me did not speak up and help me when I needed help and when I was being discriminated against. I can give you an example that I like to use.
Okay.
In my second ship, I was the chief engineer, and I was in a very difficult position. I was the only black officer on the ship. The ship had a very tough schedule. We'd had a fire and an explosion in our engine room, and I had a shaft seal that was leaking. I was on a frigate. So I convinced Surfland, the type commander, to install $1 million prototype shaft seal, because I didn't want to sink in the middle of the Persian Gulf.
Right.
But my supply officer wasn't ordering all the parts that I needed. And I was the only one having problems. And I talked to all my leadership, including him. And I finally had to create a spreadsheet that showed that he was treating me and my parts differently than he was all the other department heads. And once that happened, the captain, jumped down his throat and got those parts all ordered. But meanwhile, I'm further and further behind. So I was working day and night trying to get all my parts in so that we could fix the ship. And there was no accountability for that. He also, the captain liked the report so much, he wanted me to update it every day. And then after a few days, he told me, I want you to teach the rest of the department heads how to do this. This is a great tool. I didn't have time to submit it as a beneficial suggestion because I was so busy. I was under so much stress, I could reach up and grab a handful of hair and pull it out, and it would just detach from my head. That's how much stress I was under. But the obstacles are basically when the leadership is not aware or responsive to people reporting that they actually are having problems.
Where were you mentally, Mr. Keith? You're trying to get, this, particular situations taken care of, and you're dealing with racism.
Well, it was very, very difficult. In that engineering tour, as I said, that was the most difficult period of my entire adult life. I almost quit that job because it was just a struggle, a constant struggle, and I really didn't have anyone to bounce my perceptions off, and I really didn't have a mentor. Basically, it was, it's either sink or swim. And towards the end of my career, when I went to work for a guy who was blatantly discriminating against me, and I filed a complaint against him, the first one I'd filed in 22 years. And the military did not handle that properly. They hid it and they buried it for 10 days. And I finally saw the handwriting on the wall and put in my papers to retire. I was at a very difficult point then. I got diagnosed with chronic depression. My sister all but ordered me to go talk to somebody. And the woman that I talked to really put things in perspective to me. She told me there's no excuse for what is happening. That's all in the book. I even have the complete complaint in my book. So anybody that wants to, they can judge for themselves whether I had cause to file a complaint. But when you ask someone why they're treating you the way they are, and they smile at you and ask you if you feel like a second-class citizen, that's a pretty good indication that race is a fact.
Yes, sir. And let me ask you this. How did your family prepare you and help you understand the lingering consequences of being in the military?
Well, my father tried to prevent me from going in the military. He had served in the Army. He joined the Army at 17, and he was in Korea in a tank battalion. He became a paratrooper, and then he served in a tank battalion. He was in Korea in 53, and after he got out of the Army, he joined the Navy. So he's made 8 trips to, he served on 8 different ships. He made 4 different trips to Vietnam, and when he got out on bad terms. He had just had it. I think he had PTSD. But when I told him I wanted to join the Navy, he refused to sign the papers. He said, the Navy's too racist. I'm not going to let you join. You don't know what you're doing. And so he prepared me to accept the fact that I may face some racism. But I had watched how animated he got when he talked about his military service with his buddies. And I also knew that Admiral Zumwalt had said that all of that had changed. He issued Z-Gram number 66 on equal opportunity, which was written by his minority affairs assistant, William S. Norman, who I said they should name the ship the Stennis after. And he said that racism was gone, discrimination was gone, and there was no black Navy, no white Navy, just one Navy. Well, it didn't take me long to figure out that just because the CNO puts out a directive, that everybody's going to follow.
What did you know prior to you joining the Navy?
What did I know about what?
Yeah, what little information did you know about the Navy before joining them?
Well, having been raised by a sailor, I knew probably more than the average person, and I was an avid reader, so I read encyclopedias, I read everything I could find, on the Navy. I loved those snazzy uniforms, in the encyclopedias. I wanted to be captain of my own ship. I wanted to say, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead, But, and I knew about Robert Smalls, how he had saved the ship. I understand there's a commemorative happening up there in Charleston this week. Wish I could be there for that.
Yeah.
But I knew a lot about the Navy, more than the average person. And I had read, everything I could find, my limited availability. But there just weren't any black officers. The only black officer I knew was Admiral Sam Gravely, and he was in Jet Magazine and Ebony Magazine, but he was just a picture to me. I've since met people that knew him and worked with him and thought very highly of him. And I also read his biography called Trailblazer. It's an oral history of his career, and I've talked with the guy that actually put that book out, Paul Stillwell. So I knew more than the average person.
And what Black Navy officer resembles you in your career?
Oh, I don't think there is one. Most Black Navy officers are not outspoken about what their experiences were in the Navy. It is considered, the establishment considers it that you're attacking the Navy because you're talking about what you actually experienced. I've been called divisive. I've been called a troublemaker. I've been called, a Navy basher, and none of that's true. I've been called a racist. I've been told that the title of my book is racist, Black Sailor, White Navy. And when I explained, well, I took my title from a book that was written by a white historian, Dr. John Darrell Sherwood, who wrote a book called Black Sailor, White Navy, talking about all of the discrimination that minorities faced, and then the race riots and stuff that happened in the 70s. So why is it that my title is racist, but the title by a white historian is not? So I never get an answer to that because people have no idea what they're talking about.
Let me ask you this, Mr. Keith. What equal opportunities would be ideal for the average Black Navy officer today?
Well, it's not so much the opportunities. They have the same opportunities as everybody else. What would be ideal would be for the leadership to recognize that if a Black officer comes to you and tells you that they're having an issue with someone or something, rather than just tell them to work it out, which is what was told to me, the leadership has a responsibility to look into that and see if, in fact, there is something different happening for this Black officer than there is for anybody else under his or her command. And I was more than once I was able to prove, and a couple times I was on the verge of getting in trouble. In my last job, I had the base admiral call me in. He was he was the most decorated officer in the military at the time, even though he's a rear admiral. Vietnam War helicopter pilot hero. And he called me into his office and told me I didn't know what I was doing, and I didn't have any credibility. And he wanted me to turn my telephone department over to some civilians who most likely were going to hire him when he got out of the military. And I said, sir, with all due respect, just because you believe that doesn't make it true. So he called the Secretary of the Navy and had a performance audit done on me and my department. Turns out I was 100% right. And then he asked me if I'd come work for him. Well, after what I'd been through, I said, I don't think so. Keep your friends closer and your enemies closer, that sort of thing. But, it is a fact that Blacks sometimes have a different experience with conflict than white people do. You're going to have conflicts in the military, but when it's based on race, it is difficult for the average white person to understand what discriminatory behavior looks like, because for some of them, that's just business as usual.
What else is business as usual in this military?
I've been out of the military now for 22 years. I've been out longer than I was in. So I don't really feel like I'm qualified to, talk about what's actually happening right now. All I know is what I read in the papers and what the history books tell me, what my own experience tells me, and what people that call me up and try to explain to me. I had a lieutenant call me and said that when he tries to talk about the white officers on his ship about racism and about what he experiences, they start to lecture him rather than listen. So standard what is common is that people don't listen. They just want to give you lectures. USS George Washington just had 3 or 4 suicides, and there was just a story in my newsfeed this morning about how the people are telling them what issues they're having, the problems they're having, and they get told to just suck it up and stop complaining or you're going to get written up and so forth and so on. So the leadership has to be willing to recognize that an issue exists. And I don't know if these sailors are black, white, or purple. All I know is they're crying out for help, and they don't seem to be getting it from their direct leadership. The Navy has taken some actions to deal with that, but there needs to be more done than what's being done.
I hate to ask this too, but what are those other hidden issues that people are not really talking about in the military?
As I said, I can only speak for me and my experience. I can tell you what other people have told me, but I think the hidden issue is that racism is tolerated. They say it's not tolerated, But if you're not able to file a complaint, you're not able to find out what happens if you file a complaint, and there's no accountability. There are no statistics on racist behavior in the military. They can tell you how many people were processed for drug abuse. They can tell you how many people were processed for DUI or rape or sexual harassment, but you can't find that for discrimination because it doesn't exist. The Navy has not. It's been more than 70 years since Truman desegregated the armed forces, and they still don't have a charge and specification for racism and discrimination. I don't know how that's even possible.
If you were to talk to Congress today, what would you tell them about the military? And what would you ask them to add to the military?
I would ask them to have the military report the annual discrimination complaint statistics, formal complaints, the way they used to when Congressman Ron Dellums required the military to submit that. He made a tour of all the military bases and found out all these people were having all these problems because they were contacting his office. He was a former Marine who was rejected for a Marine officer candidate school when they found out that he was black. So he had personal experience with discrimination in the military. So I would tell Congress to add the discrimination complaint statistics that were dropped in 2006 or 7 to have the military report those, because a sailor or a Marine or a soldier should be able to look at that information and see what the trend is in terms of how many complaints are being filed, how many are being substantiated, and how many are not. You can't find that anywhere. I've got the most complete set of that data of anybody that I know of, and I've been out of the military for 22 years. You can't find it anywhere. So Congress needs to be brought aware of that, same way they are with the sexual harassment statistics. They eventually decided they were going to take that authority away from the military because they weren't handling it well. So I think it's time to look at how they're handling discrimination complaints, because that's been an issue a lot longer than sexual harassment in the military has.
And how many of those sexual harassment complaints have been made public and been known to Congress?
I couldn't answer that because some of that has to do with Privacy Act information. The people that have come forward and talked about that, you can find those stories online, etc. But I really couldn't answer that.
Now, let me ask you this, Mr. Keith. If you could go back to the military today, what would you do differently?
If I could go back to the military, what would I do differently? One of the things I would do differently is I would confront the behavior that I was dealing with in a more timely fashion, particularly in my last job. I knew what was happening, but no one ever brought up the issue of race. I would have pushed for a resolution. I'll give you an example. I was the director of the telephone office and the facilities department. I ran 2 departments at that command, but I didn't have a telephone. Every time I had to order one, my comptroller, who was a former enlisted Marine, would take the phone and give it to somebody else and tell me he'd order me another. This was a personal resource denial that was happening. And I would talk to my commanding officer about it, and he would say, well, I'll talk to him. Nothing ever happened. So he was supporting that behavior. So what I would do is, rather than wait till the end of my career when I was about the edge of violence, I would have addressed it, filed a complaint about that and dealt with that issue, and if necessary, filed another complaint. But when you're in an environment where everyone knows what is happening and the leadership is complicit in it or apathetic to it, then I don't know what else you can do. But I would have addressed issues in a more forthright manner rather than waiting until it was affecting my mental health.
And what other personal resources denials that have been, taking place with African American military personnel because of their race?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question. What was the question?
Oh, yes, sir. What other personal resources denials have been going on inside the military with African American people due to their race?
Well, that's one of the things I said. I've been out of the military for a long time. I couldn't address that. I can tell you that the number of senior, and particularly in the Navy, the number of senior military people has been dropping. There are 240 admirals in the Navy, and only 8 or 10 of those are minorities, and none of them were above the 2-star rank. So something is happening that is causing those numbers to shrink, and the leadership needs to look at that. And you can't fix that now. It's going to take decades to fix that. What you have to do is look at what is happening, and they've got tons and tons of data. The 73 recommendations that came out from the 1988 CNO study have never been made public. The recommendations from the Task Force One Navy study have been made public, and they're working on those, but they don't tell you how the sausage is made.
Are they? You thinking that they're actually hiding?
I would not know that, but I did talk to the Task Force One Navy Admiral, and he called me, and I told him, he asked me what I thought the report should say, and I said, sir, it doesn't really matter what your report says. There's a stack of those reports. What matters is what you start doing about the everyday discrimination that people are reporting. Almost 50% of the minorities that were surveyed said that they faced racism, discrimination, and extremist behavior while on active duty in the military, as is happening right now. But there is no plan to deal with those individual. That discrimination is coming from someone. But there is no plan for dealing with that behavior. I'm not saying everybody should be kicked out, but what I'm saying is you need to hold them accountable and teach them that that behavior is no longer acceptable. So that's the part. The accountability part is where I see the military falling short.
And how many African American people are actually in active duty today?
The numbers vary. I don't know the exact numbers. You got about 1 million people, a little more than 1 million, and almost 40% of the military now is minorities. I know 20% of the Navy enlisted service is minority, and 7.5 or so percent of the officer corps is minority or black. So the numbers are rising. Our military is getting more diverse every year, but our leadership is getting wider and wider. The Marine Corps, in particular, has got some very white leadership. Frank Peterson is going to be commissioned in Charleston. I've read his memoir, and he talks about all the discrimination he faced. So I can't address that specifically, but you can look it up. You can Google U.S. military demographics, and it'll give you the most recent information that's available. But it just depends on the service.
Going to the Marine Corps, I mean, how should they change that leadership right now?
I'm not in a position to address that. I don't know if it's a leadership change. I think it's a perspective change that needs to happen.
And speaking of which, let's go back to your memoir, Black Officer, White Navy, which is likely the first memoir of a black naval officer who rose from high school dropout to an unrestricted line officer in the post-Vietnam War era. If you could go back if you could go back right now, Mr. Keith, what chapter would you add to that book?
If I could go back right now, what chapter would I add to that book? It's funny you ask that because I have a book contract to revise the book.
Okay.
And the chapter that I'm going to add is the aftermath of what happened after I published the book. The articles that I wrote, the interviews I've done, the things that have happened that have moved in the direction. I talked about Confederate flag issue. I talked about the problem with beards. I talked about respect. I talked about the naming of a warship after an avowed segregationist. He called the desk in his office the flagship of the Confederacy. Now that's a sitting congressman, chairman of the Armed Services Committee, and he calls his office and his desk the flagship of the Confederacy. So what I would add is a chapter on why it's important to tell your story and how one person has been able to influence the discussion and the dialogue by telling his story. So that's what I would add, and I tend to add that at the end of my book.
And why was it important for you to tell your story now?
Because I saw what was happening in the run-up to the 2016 election. I knew that a divisive leader would cause division within the military because young men and women tend to emulate strong leaders. And what we were seeing was the projection of strength from a person who had personal issues of his own with minorities. I've been studying Donald Trump's career and behavior since the 70s. So I knew we were headed for a rocky road. My book came out about a month after the Charlottesville incident, and the comments he made disturbed me then, and certainly the comments has made since have disturbed me. So I knew that there was going to be a period of turmoil such as what existed in the 70s. I wanted to alarm people and make people aware of what was coming so that they could counter some of the actions that would be forthcoming. I was shocked to learn that the President of the United States was asking his Secretary of Defense if we could go out and shoot protesters because they were protesting his the killing of George Floyd. I never thought I'd see something like that in my lifetime again, but sure enough, it did happen.
Reuben Keith Green, thank you so much for your time, and welcome to Quintin's Close-Ups. I wish I could talk to you more, but we'll come back and get you later this summer.
Hey, Quintin, be happy to be on anytime you want me. Thank you.
Thank you.